Right. Yeah. Now we can start today's talk. We are coming back after a long hiatus. Um, those of you who are present with us live, there is a couple of housekeeping rules. Do not, uh, we would ask you not to unmute yourselves while the talk is going on. However, after the talk is over, you can raise your hands, and when I call, you can unmute and speak your comments or questions that you have for Tushya. Uh, Tushya, are we ready? We can start?
Yeah,
Okay, give me 1 second. I need to
yeah,
do the intro. Yeah. Tushya Sachan is a PhD research scholar in the Department of Psychology at the University of Delhi. Her research offers an insider's perspective on video game studies with a focus on online gaming communities, social interactions, player agency, anarchy servers, and virtual identities. Being an avid gamer herself, she enjoys time spending in exploration, survival, and horror games. Today, she is here to present her talk, Cross-Border Conflicts in Gaming, Indo-Pak Tensions in Competitive Multiplayer Spaces. I will hand it over to Tushya now. You can start the talk.
yeah. I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, it is.
All right. Hello and good evening to everyone who's joining for this talk. I'm Tushya. As so nicely introduced, I have largely focused on online gaming communities and the connections that we make within them. So, what I have specifically looked into is the role of online identities. So, how we present ourselves, um, extensions of ourselves in the online space, which it's quite interesting because we can modify it and we can hide it and we can sort of put our best foot forward and we can control who has access to our self presentations. So how do these online identities sort of affect who we are connecting with? And so in the past, I have largely looked at identities around sexualities and gender. Um, and this is sort of a place for me to sort of talk about national identities and what better place to study how national identities come up for Indian gamers than looking at Indian Pakistan player interactions. So with this study emerged, looking into Indo-Pak tensions as a powerful force, which is affecting the interactions within competitive multiplayer spaces. So, as most of us are aware, India and Pakistan do share quite the history. From the starting a war right at the point that the nations were born, essentially. So, over the years, the two countries have gone through several wars, conflicts over uh, regions of Kashmir, ceasefire violations, terrorist attacks, retaliatory surgical strikes. And just a few months ago, after another terrorist attack, we had come pretty close to another all-out war. So now, of course, despite these conflicts, there is an underlying discourse of peace. Many people from both sides of the border want mutual understanding and respectful communication, and probably opportunities to connect beyond just the political narrative. However, the general portrayal is that of a more overpowering discourse of conflict, and it has deeply embedded itself into cultural narratives, sense of nationalism, and even the media content, movies around it, TV series around it. So, that is to say that citizens are now often approaching each other with stereotypes, generalizations, defensiveness, assumptions that are rooted really a lot in nationalistic sentiments. So, over time, things that were meant to bring peaceful contact between India and Pakistan, like cricket matches, they dissolved into much more hateful places of rivalry. um, and if you lose the match, you're essentially bringing shame to the nation, and this it's sort of seen as a loss of one nation against the other as a whole. So we can see that like these stereotypes that and animosity that emerged from all of the offline conflicts and political spaces, how it has sort of seeped into online spaces. And essentially any place of interaction, whether it be YouTube comments or Reddit, or Instagram, Facebook replies. So basically, in part, this is because we carry with us a lot of our offline identities into online spaces. Um, so, as one researcher pointed out, the boundaries between space based and place based identities are very interconnected and often permeable. And so basically, a lot of researchers have done this before, where they have seen gaming spaces as these third places, neutral grounds for socialization, where a new sort of culture is emerging. And yes, there are certain gaming communities where which can be seen as a very neutral, almost a new thing of its own. But there is a more optimistic, more positive take on it. We don't simply shut off our offline identities when we step into online spaces. We carry them with us. We carry them in our conversations, and we carry them, like certain identities become salient, especially when they're activated or threatened. So basically, with this sort of background in mind, I wanted to look at how geopolitical tensions between India and Pakistan manifested in cross border social interactions, and that too specifically within multiplayer competitive games. So I looked at a lot of these games like Rust, Valorant, Counter Strike 2, PUBG Battlegrounds, Rainbow Six Siege, Fortnite, Brawlhalla, Apex Legends, and other such, competitive games. Now, the reason for why I was specifically looking at competitive games was basically there were two reasons. The first was the players from both of these countries are more likely to connect on similar servers because they have similarity in their pings. Because of geographical proximity, they're more likely to connect on the same server for that particular game. And the second is that competitive games like Valorant, CS:GO, they provide an environment where teamwork is required. You have to cooperate, and in best case scenarios, you have to communicate. A lot of people are using in game voice options, so to directly tell the position of, for example, the enemy. So people use in-game mic, or they're using text chat. So these games naturally they create this opportunity for meaningful cross-player interactions, and these interactions can either go into collaboration or escalate to conflict. So to sort of gather data on this, on people's experiences, I conducted semi-structured interviews with players from both sides of the border, and then these interviews were thematically analyzed. So who could participate? They had to be adults. They had to be currently residing in their country. That is more so because so that they could connect with players of the other nation. They had to have at least some experience with playing these competitive games. They had to have interactions with players of the other nation, and for basic proficiency in Hindi or English just to communicate. I did use purposive and snowballing sampling, and getting participants from Pakistan was a bit more difficult than getting participants in India. So I did use flyers that I had advertised on Discord and Instagram. Um, and I also recruited people by joining, Discord servers that were specifically, like Indian Discord servers, Pakistani Discord servers. I also used neutral spaces within multiplayer games themselves to sort of create a place where people could approach me, or I could approach people and sort of share what the research is about, and that they can join. And all of these interviews were done online on Google Meet or Discord. These are just some screenshots from within game interviews. So ultimately, 11 Indian and 12 Pakistani players participated. Most of them were young adults, with a mean age of 21.5 years. Only one person was above the age of 30. Now, the fact that these are all men is purely coincidental, and it's likely a reflection of just the fact that there is a gender imbalance in South Asian competitive multiplayer gaming spaces. So participants were asked a lot of questions around the themes of in-game interaction, the nature of these interactions, if they had experienced these as hostile or cooperative or neutral, what did they think was the role of voice chat or text chat or other game dynamics in shaping these interactions? What were their emotional responses to their experiences? How did they perceive, of why these interactions were unfolding as they did? And what did they anticipate from the future? Now, of course, in asking these questions, these are just some of the sample questions that I have shown here. There were a lot more questions, and I was also a bit careful to sort of ask both positive and negative of like the same coin. So for example, have you encountered instances of hostility or conflict? But then there was also a positively worded, have you experienced moments of cooperation or teamwork, so that I could get sort of both sides and not just focus on the negative. Um, Results. So, as I stated before, these interviews were thematically analyzed, and my approach to this was more inductive rather than deductive, meaning that um, I developed the themes, purely from whatever pattern was emerging from the data. I didn't try to apply some existing theories on it to, some existing frameworks on this. So the quote here reads, as long as there's no triggers, we are just friends, we are just humans. And it sort of aptly summarizes the findings of the study as we will see ahead. Uh, just a little bit of a warning on crude language, not crude language per se. I made sure to remove that, but certain crude takes on the situation, which are representative of what the participants were thinking. So to begin with, there were a lot of ways in which you would ask, how did an Indian player know that this other player is Pakistani, or how did this Pakistani player know that this other player is Indian? So to begin with, there were a lot of ways in which players recognized the country of the other nation. Sometimes they would just directly tell their countries, but that was rather rare. In most cases, what was sort of a giveaway was the accent difference or differences in the way that words or phrases were used. So, for instance, one participant said there is a lot of difference between Indian Punjabi and Pakistani or Multani Punjabi. Another participant said mostly the accent is a giveaway. Hindi and Urdu also have some difference in wordings. And a lot of players showed quite confidence in their ability to recognize what country the other player is from, especially if it's like Pakistan or India. There was also, interestingly, a difference in the way that the players of the different countries abused, although I haven't included examples of that. Also, ping difference. So, this is sort of where the role of the platform comes in. So, a lot of video games show ping difference. And this lets players guess where the other player is from. So this quote says, if we play Mumbai servers, so this is a Pakistani player, our ping is 20 to 30% higher. And this is also something which Indian players reported that, they have higher ping. If their ping is 20 to 30% higher, they're likely from Pakistan. Um, so also game distribution platforms like Steam, also they give the option of displaying, your city, your country. So if someone is really interesting in knowing you, if they really want to check out your profile, then they can just go to your Steam and they can see if you've displayed a country or not. Um, so, um, so coming to the first major theme, I would sort of like to read these quotes here to sort of emphasize the gravity of the theme. We use Pakistani as an abuse. Pakistani players know that. Consciously, we think he's a nice guy, but subconsciously, we are like, he's a Pakistani at the end of the day. Can we really trust him? Anytime we play with Indians, we say, you lost the World Cup. We cooked a cow today. Mostly Pakistani and Indians, pretty high on patriotism, you start fighting over things. So, as I mentioned in the introduction and the background to the study, a lot of the stereotypes and generalizations get carried over to online spaces, including video games, and they sort of emerge as these forces which are really strongly affecting the interactions. And as I went through the interviews, I realized that there were several stereotypes both towards Pakistani players as well as Indian players. So, for example, certain recurring stereotypes about Pakistani players were that, they don't like being out of their own community. They don't want to engage with others. They're very religious, or that they have bad internet. Certain stereotypes towards Indian players were that they believe they're more skilled or superior than they actually are. They're prideful nationalists. They are immediately toxic. So it's quite interesting to see that a lot of these players were aware that there are certain topics, which are sort of, these uh, triggering points to start a conflict. If they want to start a conflict, they can just take up one of these topics. And these topics were, often centered around politics, religion, nation. So if you really want to hurt your opponent, if you really want to provoke them, then the most effective way is that you just pick up one of these topics and you talk about them. But other than just patriotism and stereotype, there were a lot of other variables that were affecting the degree of toxic interaction that was taking place. So these are just some of the variables that participants pointed out. Rank up or rank down matches. If you're losing, then toxicity increases. Toxicity depends on the whole group. If only one is Indian, then he won't say anything. Remove maths from the game. Rank, KD ratio, points with killing and death ratio, points. It becomes hostile because people are afraid of losing points. And I think this last one is, it's quite interesting. It's better if we meet indirectly on servers where there are people from other nations rather than strictly on servers with just Indians and Pakistanis. We behave better in front of white people. That's also quite an interesting take. So I was able to club these variables under certain player variables and game variables. Uh, yeah. So for players, participants said that age, maturity, the culture or social learning, all of these played very important role. So for example, younger players were more prone to toxic behavior due to lack of maturity, and higher emotional reactivity. It's also interesting that a few players actually mentioned their own journey of growth, as in they compared themselves right now with how they once were. They talked about, when in previous days when they used to be younger, how they were more toxic and how easily sort of triggered they were by certain things, and they would also retaliate. But then they reflect and they say that, as we have grown up, we see that there are differences. Um, Next, we have game variables. So, for games, a lot of participants acknowledge that competitive games themselves, they foster a rather stressful and hostile environment where there is pressure on you. Usually, there are scores, time is ticking down. If you maybe mess up, then it's a loss for the whole team. So it creates sort of this area of this environment of stress. And so it sort of fosters toxicity in a way. It makes things more likely to become hostile. So and especially, if there are stakes involved. So if it's a match where your rank goes up or your rank goes down, so of course, a combination of these, if it's a high stake game, if you have, young players, who are more hot blooded, maybe it's more likely to, go into toxic territory. Now, one variable that didn't emerge, but I would just like to mention here, I think, is the role of moderating systems within the game itself. So, for example, recently Rainbow Six Siege has introduced this moderating system, or like a system basically which is based on reputation. And if your reputation, depending on, if you shot at your teammates, if you wrote abuses in the chat, so, and they have built a very clever way of recognizing if people are, for example, putting spaces between their abuses, their system still gets it. So, your reputation decreases a lot, and the amount of awards that you get are reduced. And if your reputation is low enough, then you won't even be able to open your mic or text in the chat. So I do feel that the moderating role of the games themselves also plays like a very important role. Now, even the matchmaking system, it's quite important. So for example, if a match is made where teams with the majority of players from one nation are there, and a minority from another nation, then of course it would create an environment conducive to in-game bullying. So the next theme that emerged was external influence on in-game interactions. A lot of players from both countries were very socially and politically aware, as we can see by these quotes. Indian media influences people leads to higher Islamophobia. They see things on media and they think we are terrorists. There is always going to be news, and the more you hear, the more you will hate them. I don't understand why we hate them. The geopolitical conflict was started by the Britishers, and I don't know why we are still continuing it. So it sort of goes on to show that most participants know that, there are external factors like social media, news, politics, propaganda, and it plays quite a strong role in how people are interacting. They described social media. So for example, uh, they have said that, there are certain narratives that the media likes to talk about, that politicians like to talk about, whether it, earns them vote bank, or whether it earns them higher, rating, if it's about media or social media posts. um, Social media especially was, identified as quite the space for where toxicity is, very much present, especially on Instagram and Facebook. So what was what was kind of important was that players were aware that their own parents, their own community has played a role in how they are looking at players of the other nation, in within the game, and how continuous exposure to all of these things would sort of maintain animosity and hate. Now, reaction to toxicity. The players' reactions to toxicity were very different. Sometimes they would retaliate, sometimes they would mitigate, sometimes they would remove themselves from the situations, and in rare cases, they would even enjoy it. The quotes read, I abuse back. I say, go back to your server. If they say something about religion, then I retaliate. When we play a game, it's for fun. Now, this is the more rare take. When we play a game, it's for fun. And when Pakistani and Indians are toxic to each other, it gets me excited, active and excited. Toxicity makes games fun. Someone else said, if the majority is toxic, then I leave. And someone else said, it's so dehumanizing when you get that pure disgust coming out of someone's mouth. It makes you feel like a lesser human. You just want to quit and take the game ban. So, yeah, reactions and responses were of different types. Players talked about their feelings when they were targets of toxicity. There was avoidance or disengagement. For example, just muting the other person. And sometimes, they avoided conversation of out of game stuff, like religion and politics. But there was also retaliation. Sometimes it was direct. So, if someone is abused, they would abuse back. So, aggression was responded to. And sometimes it was indirect. So, for example, they would just stop cooperating in the game. They would essentially what is called throwing the match. They would throw the match. Um, Sometimes they would be willing to take the game ban. So, for if someone isn't aware, if you're in a competitive match and you leave the match midway, then the game sort of penalizes you in certain way for stepping out of the match. So they were willing to take that penalty. And it's also important that it led players to conclusions and realizations about the game, which is that, oh, this game is just toxic in general, but also about players from the other nation. So essentially, what's happening is that they are sort of building a schema about players from the other country. And when this schema gets strong enough that, for example, players from the other country are just toxic, if that is the schema, then a positive interaction that takes place becomes is treated essentially as an exception. It doesn't change or modify the schema, it becomes an exception. So the idea remains that most players from India are toxic, even if you have one positive interaction. So now, what was also extremely important was that players recognized that there are vicious cycles of passing on toxicity. So, for example, at time one, if there was a negative interaction with the player of the other nation, then at time two, this can lead to initiation of future hostility. even when players from the other nation were now interacting without animosity. So it's important that players showed awareness that this is a cycle, and then it continues in its sort of negative ways. Because if you are aware of the fact that it's a cycle, then you can reflect on it in case you are faced with hostility by someone. um, so sort of leading back to the idea of the multiple identities that we carry. It isn't just sure, nationalism here is the salient identity, it's the central identity around which conflict is happening. But several other identities also seem to play a role. So for example, religion, region, language, so it very much further complicated these interactions. The quotes read, on Dubai servers, there are Arabs, some of whom can be pretty racist. Pakistani and Indians are all the same to them. Arabs assume Pakistani and Indians are Indians and abuse them like they would abuse Indians. Any Muslim is very dedicated to their religion. So you target their religion during toxicity because it hurts the most. I'm from Pakistan's Punjab, and there are Indian Punjabis as well. It's better to play with them. Our language is the same, our culture is the same. So, what this highlights is that it's not just national identity which plays a role here, rather, it doesn't exist in isolation. Rather, it's sort of an amalgamation of all of the other identities. Um, so, for example, Pakistani players who were from Pakistan's Punjab region shared very positive rapport with players from India's Punjab because they shared this linguistic and cultural background. Comparatively, their interaction with the rest of players, like from other parts of India, was not as good. And another example is when players from other regions, like Arab speaking countries, were present. This suddenly introduced a third party which was hostile towards both Pakistanis as well as Indians, and sort of clubbed them all under the identity of Indians. So how suddenly you're dealing with a third party which is showing a stronger hostility towards both of these groups. Now, of course, there's an interplay here as well. When people are angry or frustrated, they want to be toxic, they try to target sensitive issues. So religion sort of becomes a very easy target because it adds a deeper, more personal layer to the conflict. And there is a lot of generalization. So, for example, Pakistanis see Indians as Hindus. So they use Hindu targeting insults. And Indians see Pakistanis as Muslims. So they use Islam targeting insults. And so, this sort of shows the overlap between these identities. Um, Sort of on a more positive note, although I would like to clarify that this particular theme wasn't as strong and was only present for certain players, only in certain interviews, is video games as means to further cross cultural understanding. So, not all players thought that it was possible, but some of them did think that video games can act as a means to mitigate tension, and to better know people from across the border. So, I would read the quotes. In game, people are talking to each other and interacting with each other. You realize that the other person is not as bad as you think they are, or as they are portrayed in movies. You have a new way of knowing what's happening in each other's country without media, without social media. Sometimes you need to play continuously for a while before the jokes or toxicity leaves the context. So, some players did have friends across the border. They were optimistic that long term interactions or continuous gameplay could help dissolve the initial hostility and build rapport. They believe that players with less exposure to sociopolitical narratives, often displayed less ingrained hostility. And some players even suggested that when you're within the game, keep your friendship limited to the game. Don't try to connect on a more personal level so that you can avoid these external topics, of politics, religion, nation, which can trigger conflicts. So, it, in conclusion, communication through games provided an alternate medium of contact between people of the two nations and reduced reliance on what was perceived as biased media narratives, and it helped people reevaluate, or like it gives the opportunity to reevaluate whatever stereotypes you might be holding about people from the other nation. The results show that competitive video games can be both sites of conflict as well as places where we can, nurture a cross-cultural dialogue. So theoretically, these findings have certain implications. So, for example, we see that we see how real world, or I would rather use the word offline conflicts, move into virtual spaces, and spaces aren't as neutral as we would like to believe, and we carry over offline hostilities into digital spaces. Then we also saw the interplay of identities, how overlapping social identities basically influence in-game behaviors and perceptions. Importantly, and probably from also a point of view of intervention, we saw that there are negative interactions which can reinforce existing stereotypes and trigger retaliatory behavior and sort of create these self-sustaining cycles of toxicity. Um, and we also saw that in psychology focuses on something called the contact hypothesis, where when two parties are in conflict with each other, then if there is sort of control and moderated and continuous contact between the parties, it's likely to lead to sort of a de-escalation of the conflict. But so it sort of shows the limitations of video games in supporting the contact hypothesis, because games do offer the opportunity to connect, but at the same time there is anonymity, there is reduced sort of accountability, there is de-individualization, there is basically a weakened potential of interactions to actually lead to mutual understanding unless they're sustained. So, in terms of game development, basically, it's important to consider socio-political factors in matchmaking, take into account and maybe also look at regional languages when it comes to detecting toxicity, monitoring it in text, and maybe even, sort of display not non-intrusive reminders to discourage targeting and toxicity. And I would sort of want to bring also towards the limitations of the study and why these themes might not universally apply. Of course, the sample pool uh, aside. So I think as part of reflexivity, I did take a note that me being a female gamer from India has a very strong influence on how people like to take part in interviews. And it could be that, for example, it's just, me looking at a possibility that people might want to put their best foot forward and provide all more positive news and like more positive information about how they've been going about in their international interactions. Another could have been that when I'm advertising, as you had seen with the flyers, only people who have very strong feelings and who have had exceptional interactions with people from the other country responded. So this sort of shows only one more extreme examples. Then I only looked at competitive multiplayer games. Other genres can probably lead to different sort of interactions. Um, Only male participants responded, and I'm sure that if there were female gamers who responded, then in between all of the other identities we saw, there would be a very strong gender aspect as well, and gender-based, probably sexualization, discrimination, ostracization. And finally, I didn't probably take into account other factors that can definitely affect like socioeconomic status, education levels. As a disclaimer, these interviews were conducted before the recent escalation between India and Pakistan, before the April 2025 Pahalgam terrorist attack. And I am 100% sure that that has, you know, temporarily, even if temporarily, escalated these tensions in online spaces. And it would probably take a while for it to come down to whatever is the normal level of toxicity. So, yeah. In case anyone is interested, an extended abstract of this has been published online and they can access it.
Thank you. Thank you. It was such a beautiful talk. Uh, we really glad you decided to, you know, give this talk for us. We will go into the question answer section. So I have a few questions. Uh, Orko would you like to unmute and ask the question, or do you want me to read? Okay, I'll then read it. So the first question is, please everybody keep sending questions, or if you can speak, just raise your hand. I'll get to you and you can unmute and speak. I will first get into the question. Orgoproto is asking, during your interviews, did you come across Hindu Pakistani or Muslim Indian players? If you did, how did they respond to the religious and nationalist discourses getting toxic and abusive during in-game interactions? And how were they seen by their co-players?
Um, I did not actually come across any Hindu Pakistanis, although I did come across maybe two um, Indians who were also Muslims, and um, the toxicity wasn't as much in their case, but it was still there. And sure, religion uh, didn't really take as much of a role in how they responded to the toxicity or in the escalation of the toxicity, but it was still very much there, sort of. And again, these were just two examples, so I didn't really, these were just two instances. So I didn't really make this into a theme on its own. Um, but it also sort of showed that nationalism as an identity sort of, at least in these two cases, superseded or was seen as above just the religious identity, because they were also willing to sort of be a part of the rest of their team and hurl abuses, so to say. And sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Second part is, if you did have, how did they respond to the religious and nationalist discourses? And second part was, how were they themselves seen by their co-players?
So I believe that that part of how they were seen by their co-player is not something which was covered in the interviews. So I don't, I think anything I would say to that would be speculative.
Yeah, no, makes sense. Any more questions or comments? You can type. I'll move on to the next question. Ochinto asks, what is the objective of your conclusion regarding the generalized and oversimplified assumption done by both countries' gaming communities and their understandings of each other's toxicities? And is there any correlation between them?
I would probably pull up the chat and see if I can read that question myself.
Chintu, do you want to unmute and ask? You can do that too, if you can write it better.
Okay, I see that. What is the objective of your conclusion?
Acha, acha, acha. Do that. I
Uh,
think maybe he's asking if there is a correlation that you saw or you saw between the
um, yeah,
go
I would say that it's kind of difficult to sort of conclude, to have one conclusive um, sort of a response to this, or draw one generalized conclusion from the generalized, from the oversimplification assumption. It's just, I think the one conclusion that I would draw from this is um, that overall, I believe that online spaces, especially in terms of uh, competitive gaming communities, only seek to, or like in 90% of the cases, seek to strengthen the generalizations and oversimplifications, because people don't get enough time to be in contact with each other. And whatever negatives that they come with become stronger if one thing goes wrong. And in online competitive spaces, there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong. If your team is losing, if you fail to make the shot count, if you accidentally, damage your own team members. So there's a lot of potential for things to go wrong. Um, and then, like one of the other participants pointed out, you sort of immediately go to um, a very personal uh, targeting, and you immediately look at the person's profile. You look at their profile, you try to look for a flag, you look at their friends, you look at the names. So unfortunately, I would say that at least the multiplayer spaces, um, they have a much more, these competitive spaces, they have a much more potential for strengthening these oversimplifications and generalizations than they have to actually bring people together and sort of create more understanding and space.
All right. Yeah. So the next question, Swapnesh wants to ask, can you?
Yeah. Hi, Tushya. It was a really interesting study to go through. So I have two things in mind while he was presenting. I was thinking about it. First is I was thinking about the player agency. So the does it also depend on, or have you looked at the how the player agency, the kind of the toxicity that they assert, or the kind of things that they can talk over to the other player in the online virtual worlds. Does it also depends on how the games are structured? Could you identify some of the elements in the game which allows this kind of a context to emerge in the game?
The context to sort of talk to each other and target each other.
Yeah, that one is this voiceover feature.
Hmm.
But is
Hmm.
there like in the multiplayer competitive game, is there something in the game structure also wherein the players can express themselves, their identities about this cross-border conflict thing specifically?
So the most straightforward one is, of course, in-game speaking, and that is, I would say, after that, right after that, there is in-game text features. But other than that, a lot of games have these text overlays on the side where, like the shooting is happening in the middle. On the right side, maybe the text is moving up. And so a lot of games sort of also give this feature where you can click on the name, and clicking on the game sorry, clicking on the name of the players takes you to a particular profile. And from there on, so to identify, uh, you only have to click on the name of that person. Or even some games of give the opportunity to go back to previous games or look at previous people that you've been in one particular match with. So a lot of these give through like access to the other player and more personal information about them. And it sort of goes downhill from there because people use these. And also, like I said, players which show ping. CSGO shows ping. Rainbow Six Siege, it shows the ping of the player. And people are smart enough to recognize that if there's a ping difference, then how much ping difference means that someone is from Pakistan or someone is from, in the same city, and all of these things. So people are able to recognize all of these little things after a few, after a while of playing. I hope that answers your question.
To some extent, I was also thinking these are the some specific features which allow the players to
Mm.
identify the identity of the other people. But
Mm.
is there something in the game itself which encourages these kind of topics to come out, or these kind of conversations to come out?
Right, right. So the thing is, with competitive multiplayer games, what games encourages is toxicity. And the second thing which it encourages is, and there have been a lot of studies on this, so you might be interested in looking them up, is how do games depict uh, the bad guys? How do games depict the Middle East? How do games depict terrorists? And so a lot of work has been done on this. Especially because terrorists have been depicted in certain ways, and they have been depicted in relation to certain identities. uh, and the good guys are visibly ethnically white, for example. So of course there are these other features which are very subtle within the game, but they do you know um, you do sort of associate it with certain countries and with certain religions. So definitely there's a role within the game itself, and certain player models which the game shows.
Yeah, interesting. So I was thinking it would be interesting to see, let's say one, if I've identified someone from a particular identity, then how do I extend that identity in the game and express myself as if I'm talking to that person in the game rather than talking to the person directly. I mean, through my mechanics, through my actions.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure if I'm with you. I mean, I've understood you fully.
Yeah. Yeah, the second thing that I was thinking
Yeah.
about is one of the your slide, participants said the toxicity is part of the fun.
Hmm.
So, do they really mean what they're talking inside the game, or if we ask them generally outside the game context, they will say like, we don't mean these things. It's just part of the fun. That's why we say these things.
Yes, yes, that is exactly what had emerged. What they mean when they say toxicity is part of the fun is that they often do associate it with a, we didn't really mean it. We just say it because that's how games are. I think Rachel Covert, this researcher, has done some wonderful work on what she has called gaming culture, and how gaming culture is more and more moving towards a very a normalization of toxicity, normalization of slurs, normalization of crossing boundaries and personal targeting, and it's seen as a very normal act. It's not seen as unusual. um, and yeah, so it becomes more and more difficult for games also to control how people are expressing, because there's this culture now of normalization within games of abuses and targeting,
Yeah, without which they might not find it fun.
without which apparently they don't. Again, this was a very exceptional theme, like a very exceptional quote. I did put it there because I found it very interesting, but a lot of people didn't say this. One or two people said this, or maybe one or two people admitted to this. Most of them didn't.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions.
Thank you for those really wonderful conversation. I think we are coming towards the end, but however, I have a few questions and comments, mostly based upon the conversation preceding this. Like my thought is more in terms of the word performance, and I mean it in two parts. The first part I want to ask is how and if this was reflected or commented upon, how the in-game performance, and I just mean on the ludic level,
Hmm.
how their performance of the game's objectives and actions, whether they were affected or whether they were filtered through this ambience of cross-border toxicity. That's the
Yeah.
first question. And second of all, as you
Can I
told,
answer the first question
okay,
first?
okay, okay,
Yeah,
yes, yes,
I'll
yes.
forget the second question
No,
otherwise.
no, no, no. Yes, yes,
Okay,
yes.
so definitely there was a very strong. So first of all, it was affected by nation. People did say that they are willing to leave the match or drop any ideas of cooperation if they are in the same team as someone who is from the other country. I got this a lot. I got this more from Indians than I got this from Pakistanis. Second, like I said, games, they provide this opportunity. They provide a lot of opportunity for slipping up, so to say, in a very competitive and tough environment. And as soon as that would happen, that sort of gives people an excuse to sort of bring in these identities. And a lot of people also responded to it by just, or not a lot, but like some people did mention about dropping the, not just cooperation, but like actively working against, but in ways that the game doesn't ban them. So just actively working against the team till the end of the match so that the experience is ruined for both the people. So when it comes to performance and when it comes to making kills or yeah, just all of that. I think the pressure also becomes, you know, you must have heard of stereotype lift and stereotype threat. So basically, you know, once you know, for example, that you're the only person in the group who is, you know, quote unquote, representing your nation here, suddenly I'm sure that there would also be that sort of a pressure to perform better. Although this was an aspect that I didn't explore as much in depth.
That that is an interesting, definitely. The second comment is to the other aspect of performance, where maybe this, like the competitive multiplayer space, as sort of this creates this layer of anonymity to uh, to use the jargon, carnivalesque sort of atmosphere where players feel more comfortable to just partake in all sorts of uh, misdemeanors and toxicities.
Mhm.
And I'm trying to basically think how much of this is also connected to the actions on screen, because uh, I mean, the actions on screen with respect to Rust and
Mm.
Rainbow Six Siege and all of these things, these are themselves heightened and not socially acceptable kind of as behaviors that are they are playing out. So how, if you have explored that aspect of it?
Um, I do believe I haven't fully explored it. So, you know, what I'm saying is a bit more of what I think is the case, is that there is, to some extent, there is a difference between actions versus what is being communicated. So, in the sense that your communication in game of, you know, against the player of the other nation versus how are you actually playing, what is the quality of play, are you giving results? I think to some extent, in terms of toxicity, that there is, you know, these remain separate. But it is after the toxicity exceeds a particular level, or if the toxicity, if these comments hit a particular point, specifically, for example, let's say if someone is sensitive about religion and it hits exactly in that place, then yes, there is a very high overlap between how people are communicating. And but otherwise, you know, the overlap initially, at least, it doesn't exist, because at the end of the day, people are still playing to improve their rank. People are still playing to, you know, however they say it, you know, to have fun. So they do not escalate it, um like, or like, at least the overlap is a bit less unless it hits exactly those right points for it to escalate.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I think there is no more questions, and we are also coming up on our any time. So thank you, Tushya, for that wonderful, enlightening talk, and a very important topic that is sadly not yet as much explored
Mm.
across the, the wide expanse of what game studies is. Really lovely talk. Thanks for agreeing to do this talk for us.
Welcome.
We are going to finish this. You will find this talk in a few months, hopefully, on our YouTube channel. Do subscribe to our YouTube, and you can follow on Facebook. I'm also posting the WhatsApp chat group that we have. Thank you, everybody. Hope you have all a nice day.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.